My friend Erin Flynn is a graduate archaeologist and works for the Public Archaeology Lab and has done extensive work on our collection that's at the Luthor store. And she's our speaker this evening. So Erin, I'll let you take right over.
Thanks everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. So just hopefully I won't take up too much of your time, and that way too at the end we can have some questions and answer discussion. But I figured a lot of people always have questions about what I do, why I do, what I look for. So I wanted to focus a little bit on that and about the archaeology specifically in Swansea. I thought that would be a good way to introduce it to everyone too. So I have a few examples at the end of some of the sites that I've actually found in Swansea that we can talk about. Hopefully I'll try to stay focused. It's not every day that people just say talk about archaeology, so I'll try to stay focused on the topics. But so my name's Erin Flynn. I grew up in Swansea. I've always had an interest in history and archaeology. Luckily my parents encouraged it, even though we weren't quite sure what I'd end up doing or how I'd end up doing. So I work for the Public Archaeology Lab, so most people assume that I'm associated with a university or college, but I'm actually a working professional archaeologist. And 90% of archaeologists in the United States, they actually do cultural resource management. So that means it's a consulting group that works with permitting. So that's on federal projects and also municipal projects as well. So most people are kind of like, oh, what university? But it's actually a private nonprofit company. So we actually look at or look for pre-contact or Native American before your American contact and historic sites. So that's anything 50 years or older. It's often just presence or absence when we go in and do a survey, and it's usually under a permit, federal or municipal. So another governing body is looking over our work and making sure that we're following the rules. And my company also looks at architectural resources too. So a lot of that legislation that started is through the federal government. People have always been interested in archaeology in the United States. Over 100 years, people have said it's important, so that's good for me and a little job security that it's still important. And sometimes there's also, MEPA, or Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, also can trigger surveys. So a lot of times where there's a big construction project, we're called in to be a part of that process. So that's just like a little background. But kind of the meat of it was, I wanted to talk about how we look at what's our timeline and how we look at the past. So sometimes I use these words, I forget that not everyone uses them. So, but in general, Paleo-Indian period, in New England or southern New England, we look for things that are up to 12,000 years old. So there's a long, long history here, and obviously the historic part is often highlighted, but we have another 12,000 years of Native American occupation to look for too, a long, long history. So some of the things I just want to focus on was we divide those up into periods that are called Archaic and Woodland periods, and then we have contact, which is obviously when we first see Euro-American people here. So just as a timeline. I also wanted to throw in something too. A lot of people don't think about the actual climate change, the shore levels. This is an older image of kind of the changing shorelines and also about like how people were living. We often hear about kind of mammoth hunters, Clovis hunters. But in New England, you can see that there's a lot of kind of submerged area or land. 12,000 years ago, now it's submerged, but back then it would have been usable space that the glacier receded. So sometimes when we talk about sites and how we don't maybe we don't see the 12,000-year-old sites here, it's maybe because it's inundated with water. Those shore levels are very different now, and even our rivers. So like when we look at a landscape, my eyes are a lot different than other people because I'm seeing 12,000 years of history, how dams are affecting those waterways, how climate's affecting, and where people really wanted to live. It's all about location, 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 right? And what's a good place. So Paleo-Indian period, we talk about 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. In New England, you can kind of see that map in the middle. Those are all Paleo-Indian sites, so about 12,000 years of occupation. There's none specifically in Swansea, but like I said, I do personally feel like some of our older sites could be submerged along the waterways. And that activity, and there's a potential that those sites have been inundated with soil and are still protected, and something that we could still find in time. But in the upper left corner, those are some projectiles or spearheads that people would have used. It's a style that have been associated with specific charcoal dates, so that's how we know they used them at that certain time. So I love this slide. This is kind of what we all picture. We've probably seen them in textbooks as we were younger. A friend of mine sent me this. So there was a Paleo-Indian site. They found some actual bone, and it was all turtle. And I just love that, to go back from this and be like, actually, archaeologists found this. I thought it was a great representation. It's something we don't think about. People are people. What were our resources? What was valuable back then? And we shouldn't just kind of box people in. So I really enjoy that slide. So when we look at the Archaic period, and to be honest, this is kind of my major area of study. I know there's people here who probably have a wealth of information about historic period, like Carl, and contact period, or even woodland period. But the Archaic period is my area of study. So definitely more of that 8,000 to 3,000 years ago is what I typically study. There's a lot of, the picture in the bottom is of someone or a potential person hunting with an atlatl. So a lot of times people think of Native Americans only with your bow and arrow and a specific spear point type. But there's also a lot of evidence of larger spears, and how they were attached to the spear is important to the shape. So that upper, we call them bifurcates. But it's a style that's associated specifically with the early Archaic, so that's like the 10,000 to 8,000 years ago. And we've also found a particular type of weight, which actually we have some of those weights at the Luthor Museum within their collection, and it's associated with a specific type of hunting. The atlatl itself, as it's shown or depicted in this drawing or rendering, was actually found, the wooden shaft, the weights, the spear was found in a cave, so intact, and had an 8,000-year-old date. So someone was actually able to say, like, oh, we found it, this is how they were hunting. Like, that's a pretty big deal, pretty amazing find. And so that was several years ago. We continue to find things or look for new things to understand Native peoples and how they lived. I also put in a couple of facts here about, so in general, increased diversification. So they were looking at all different food sources instead of focusing maybe on a mammoth, which most people assume we see the last mammoths dying out about 10,000 years ago in Alaska. In southern New England, we see them looking at wetland sources, like I said, the turtles and deer, and a lot of different fauna and flora seem to be really important to Native peoples at this time. We do have a period called transitional, so just like anything, you're changing from one thing to the next. But specifically in southern New England, we start to see the use of stone bowls, which is really interesting. So there's some in Rhode Island, Johnson, Rhode Island, not very far away. This is actually still intact, and you can visit it. It's an amazing site. You can actually see where stone bowls were being made and removed from the site. We do start to see increased signs or visible signs of burial ceremonialism, so we start to see maybe cemeteries where there's more than one. This is also, as we keep digging, it's amalgamation of information. So over time, this might change, or we might see that increase even earlier. But right now, from the sites that we've come across, we see some larger groups, these trade networks that go from Pennsylvania or farther. The materials are traveling really far. And just in general, like the new technologies is the stone bowls. And I always like to bring up the point that we don't, in New England, unfortunately we find the stone materials. We often don't find the birch bark canoes, the wooden canoes, the baskets, the amazing weavers that native people must have been, and we usually don't find these things. So we're only getting one part of the picture. And the picture at the bottom in the center, you can kind of see the dark soil, or maybe it's hard to see that it's soil, but dark soil and in this lighter yellow-brown color. These are all features and living surfaces, and that's a big part of my research, is trying to see what else we can learn besides what's from our stone tools. So trying to figure out the whole picture. And then eventually we get to the Woodland Period, or some people actually always called it the ceramic. It's when we actually see native pottery. You start to see the use of maize, larger communities in general, and that's based upon finding large villages, which I'll get into. Bigger houses as well, so instead of going from small wigwams, you start seeing larger long houses. So the communities seem to be changing during this time. And we have had some results from finding basketry and weaving. So we do also have that archaeological evidence for this as well. And I did want to just throw in, we do start to see maize in this period, and we do have some really early dates for it, and it's coming from the Southwest, and it's being traded this way. And I think a lot of people focus on New England Native Americans and like this use of corn, but I do think that there's actually some cons to being a maize society. And the Southwest, there's more evidence for it. The downside to this maize is agriculture, but something that a lot of people just like, oh, maize, it solves all our problems. But I do think that native people here were still focusing on their shellfish, they were hunting, they were still using all the various resources in New England, and they were all still really important. I think this was probably a minor part of their diet, and that they were still focusing on a lot of other things too. So not just to focus in like, oh, we have maize and everything's great. Like, there's some downside. One of those things that a lot of people don't realize, but there have been studies where the average life expectancy was 35, and it went down to 19 when they brought in maize. So that's mainly based on the Southwest, but a lot of people don't see how that can affect your teeth, the grinding. You're actually putting little bits of stone when you grind maize on a stone metate. And overall, that sedentism, or staying in one place with really large groups, it's harder to feed that many people. You might actually get into more fights or have more conflict. So there's just a lot, it's a very complicated and tricky subject. So like I said, by contact period or the Woodland Period, you start to see tribal areas, or we have maps kind of depicting where people were focusing and living. So this is one of those adaptations, but definitely those borders, they're definitely not fixed. I do think that there was probably some movement along the borders, and I do think that this is still a very, it's a political and tribal thing that's still discussed to this day. Tribal territories are still very a personal thing for each group. So this is just a depiction of what we have around the time of contact period. So I also wanted to go into, so we have all this great information that's been collected over the years, and a lot of our work starts with very small holes, which most people don't realize. So this is actually, I took this year. We were working on a utility easement. we dig 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter holes, so they're very small, about 2 feet by 2 feet, and maybe about 3 feet deep. That's often to look at presence, absence, so are there historic materials or Native American materials present? But a lot of it is also looking at the soil and reading and understanding, what is that telling us? Did someone plow here? Has it been really disturbed? Like, did someone come and strip all the topsoil off? Did it get flooded? It was the river here, and now it's way over there. So the soils tell us a lot of things. I won't bore you with too much of that, but a lot of what we look at deals with this minor point, or not just the stones themselves or the artifacts themselves. So artifacts, it's a big part of what we do, and obviously it's a main focus for a lot of people. So I just wanted to kind of have some basic things. A lot of the artifacts we find, or the majority of Native American or pre-contact artifacts, is that upper left corner are what we call chipping debris. So it's little pieces of stone that have been broken off a larger piece to create something else. So maybe you need to scrape a hide. So you will flake with a hammer stone, the larger rock, you will break off a piece of stone until it has a sharp edge. Maybe you'll create a spear point because you need one of those. There's various tools that you can make, and there's a lot of trash when you are making those. And primarily in this area, we see a lot of white quartz or milky quartz. The cobbles were probably all over the beach, so it was an easy thing to get. And it is an important, or for Wampanoag people, the white quartz has always been, it's kind of I would say a sacred part or an important part of tribal life. So we actually see it being taken out in veins in parts of Rhode Island and other places. I've seen personally in parts of Rehoboth and Swansea, there's these big rocky outcrops that you've probably all seen or have in your yards. A lot of those have these big distinct quartzite cobbles, which is another material we find a lot of too. It's kind of sparkly, looks sugary, and we find a lot of artifacts out of that because it was right there. Everyone knew where it was. And it was valuable and really, really sharp. We have some other artifacts here tonight. I didn't want to focus too much on, there's so many different things we could talk about, but just in general, there's a picture of a pestle in situ, so we do find these several feet in the ground. Most people don't realize or think of it just being on the surface. Grinding slabs in metate, like I said, for not just for maize, but for nuts and fruit and berries, all that you can think of. You might grind up material to make paints as well and mix with fats and decorate things. And then also various arrowheads. So a lot of those are triangular points, which is a huge, huge find in Swansea and along the shoreline in general. So popular shape or form. So other things too, there's clay pot sherds, which it probably doesn't look much, or I realize this slide is probably hard to see, but broken pots we sometimes find, not just little pieces, but actually pots that have been placed in the ground and then smushed, and it doesn't look very good from this picture, I realize, but that was from a larger pit feature where those pots were placed and then covered back up. We often find decorated pottery, personal adornment like pendants that are simple tools like that, and bone awls. Some materials just don't stay, like the bone material, it's often rots in the ground, so that was probably from a shell midden. The change in the acidity in the soil, we actually can find organic materials when you have that change in the acidity of soils. But like I said before, we don't find as much of the organic, so a lot of times what we're looking at is stone and pottery pieces. So I wanted to include this. This was an amazing site out of Carver, Mass. It's not in Swansea, but I think a lot of people, when they think of archaeology, they think of this. Slow and steady digging, large plots. This was a large data recovery. And that slow and steady, and I think I focus on, whenever I talk to people, I'm like, not just what you found, but where exactly you found it is important to me. Because I want to know how deep it is, what was it next to. And by digging slowly and in these slow and small levels, we're able to get that data and know exactly where it's from and how deep it is as compared to other things on the site. And a major find at this site was atlatl weights, or large stone weights that were placed in a pit still on the shaft, so you could see the outline of where a wooden shaft was and the spear point. So by digging slowly and being able to actually uncover that, we were able to measure the distance between the arrow and those weights and get an understanding of when you actually throw it, how far would that go? How big was the person who held it? So a lot of times people are just like, I dug this up in my yard, I found it's great. And it's like, we get so much information from the tiniest bit of data. And I just think it was such an incredible find. And most people don't realize how just by going slowly, we were able to understand things so much better. So like I said before, a big part of my research is I like to look at the dirt. So not just the arrowheads and the stones, but I'm really curious about stains in the soil. So a lot of sites, we're missing a major part of the story, right? We don't have the baskets, we don't have the mats, we don't have a lot of what people were making. We only have these stones. So a lot of times we're able to strip topsoil, and so you can, I'm sure all of you have maybe dug a hole and know that you have some dark soil and then you get to a lighter soil, or some of you might. So we get to this lighter soil that we call subsoil, and you're able to see stains that can show where people had distinctly dug. Now, obviously you can have these historically. You could have made something last week, but the context is really important. So that's another thing, as like when I said we look at the soil to get a narrative, to understand what happened here historically until maybe something older. So we get a context or an understanding of the area, and then we're able to look at these soil stains and maybe plot them and understand, that looks like, these are post molds at the top, it's kind of hard to see, but the same open area on the left is shown in a drawing. So we were able to plot them and say, I think these were fence lines, or maybe they're for a structure. And that's really important too, to understand where everything's situated. So another thing, these I actually personally dug. These were charcoal pits. They were almost 3 feet below ground before you even saw them. Most people don't understand how that could actually happen, but if you have a Dutch oven, you dig a deep hole, you get your fire going, your charcoal is really hot, you place something for cooking, you might cover it back up, but over time, that section in between is erased and only the charcoal is left behind. So we were able to get dates out of the two on the right-hand side. Those were 4,000-year-old charcoal pits from that. So we were able to send that charcoal away and get some really great dates. We use the word bioturbation, but that's the ants and the bugs, and over time the leaching of minerals in soil erases so many things. So it's really important when we do go into start excavation, that someone's there to really understand what you're looking at and able to get that information. I love the one on the right because I totally called it like a double burner. I love the idea that someone was like, oh, I'm gonna cook 2 things. I got 1, I got 2, I get it going, feed lots of people. I thought it was such a great representation of like a everyday life double burner. And I did want to put in that too, that not only cooking, but sometimes we find smaller ones that it was probably a great source for smoke. You would smoke fish, you could smoke lots of things for preservation, so that's important too. Other types of features, these are more obvious, and refuse deposits or trash pits. All of these are from a large village site in actually southern Rhode Island. These all have a lot of seafood remnants, or it's a shell midden on top. So like people are just like, oh, I got all this junk, I'm gonna put it somewhere. You can see this if you go, several years ago I went to Fiji, and it was amazing to see villages and them still making refuse pits and where they were putting everything on site. So the location of these is really important to us too, and where you might have that as compared to your house, for example. These are larger storage pits, so we believe, like, we actually found like whole sturgeon in these. These were incredibly large features at that same village. The contents, we're able to analyze what's in them, the fauna flora, which gives us also an idea of not just what people might have been saving in these pits. So for example, if you find blueberry inside the contents of a large pit like this and no blueberry outside, that might tell you that someone was saving that blueberry. They were storing it maybe in a larger pouch or birch bark thing. But also it might tell you something about when they were collecting it, when they dug this pit and put it. So it gives us an idea of seasonality. So that idea of what season were they collecting blueberries. But sometimes it also, in general, we're able to look at pollen cores or other charred seeds, and gives us an idea of how different the landscape was. So right now we all have pine trees and beech trees, but the forest was very different 5,000 years ago. And all that, those little bits of data are important to us to recreate what it was like for people back then. So this village actually too was approximately 1,000 years ago. A lot of these pits were dug. So like I was saying, so the soil and being able to look at these large areas, we also look for smaller posts to give us an idea of like actual homes, like how were these people living, how big were these houses, and it gives us an idea of also were they coming back and moving and living in the same spot. So plotted in the bottom, we have some overlapping, the idea that people came back years later and might have put the house just offset and not used the exact same spot, but how fast they were moving and how long they were living in one area. And we also see community structures. So this is all from one large village that my company was able to work on. It was a huge village, and we were able to get a lot of data about how people were living, and then also that they did have these large community structures. What does that say about how the people were interacting amongst themselves? Like, if we're not just looking at small individual houses, what do these larger houses say and how people interact? It's all part of like how we come up with our narrative. So villages too. I wanted to include this. This was from a book I have that it shows a lot of the late woodland sites, so kind of right before contact and where we're starting to see these villages. These are by no means exhausted. These are not all the villages. These are the ones that we've actually found in the archaeological record. And it gives you an idea too of some, if they weren't destroyed. I just thought that this idea, this kind of romanticized village, it gives you an idea of these larger communities and how well settled they were. And having these structures and looking at these larger villages, we also can look at population size. We do have contact period references about how many people were living in homes, but it's being able to take Roger Williams' quotes and being able to put it to an area and say, oh, I think there was about 60 people living here. And being able to look across southern New England and understand how those communities were interacting is important too. So that same village, this is one of the areas. You can see all of those are large storage pits. There's also small posts. It was an unbelievably large site. And for an archaeological eye, you see this, I see this. Just that lens, how it changes, and how important a subtlety in the soil. I see this. So as we get further on the timeline, I just wanted to bring up this Colonial Interaction. So the Euro-Americans coming to the United States, it just didn't happen Mayflower. I think a lot of kids, you know, we learn in school like, oh, they came and they're pilgrims and Plymouth Plantation, yay. But a lot of the information that I look at actually comes from some of the diaries. Verrazano, 1524, some of his observations are amazing. And there's a lot of really amazing entries of him actually in his boat going along the New England coastline and seeing thousands of fires and being like, whoa, how many people are over there? I thought there was going to be no one. It's an amazing encounter story. So I recommend if anyone's interested, those are some great stories. We reference them a lot, especially too, because he was ducking into bays and looking along that coast. There are some interactions, and I know that there was some interactions specifically on Block Island too, where they were getting off the boat, but this is just showing you some of those major voyages. It was getting busy. People were coming and checking things out, and it wasn't just Pilgrim's Landing, and that was it. So around this time too, there were several epidemics. I think it's touched upon in school, but we're really not totally sure on the totals, but I don't think everyone realizes the extreme nature of the diseases that hit native groups. So measles, smallpox, we're unsure of all of them, but they were huge plagues. I've heard estimates. This was saying that in Massachusetts, there went from 30,000 to 500 people. If you can imagine what that does to a community, it's overwhelming. I know that there were reports of, not from Verrazano, but from other early encounters of just finding like full abandoned villages still with the food hanging from the rafters. So if you can imagine coming into a place that was so decimated by just those simple interactions. Some people actually put the numbers at close to 60,000 down to 1,000, but we're unsure of those totals, but it was a huge, huge loss for Native people. So definitely important to this area, and probably David and Carl might know more, but Massasoit Sachem, so in 1620, signed a peace treaty. Obviously, there's a lot to think about. If you went from having 30,000 people to 500 people, how you'd treat newcomers would be very different than a healthy, swelling population with lots of food. Massasoit is well known for 50 years of peace. I don't think we have had 50 years of peace with any president we've had. So if you can imagine Massasoit coming in and making it work for 50 years, it's an amazing feat. I did want to include, this is an old picture in the upper right of Burrs Hill in Warren, and the stone that was placed there in the past maybe 2 years. Massasoit, after 20 years of searching, Ramona Peters and other NAGPRO specialists were able to reinter or rebury Massasoit at Burrs Hill. It's an incredibly important site that's actually taken a beating over the years from railroad construction. The Warren Town Beach is right there. There's tons of houses. It was an incredibly important site. And I think that there's huge connections with Burrs Hill and Swansea. I mean, the stories there are, they all talk about the connections. I actually think it's incredibly interesting that some of the early writings about Swansea, or in 1947, the Massachusetts Archaeological Society actually wrote a short article about 5 burials found in Gardner's Neck. And at the time, they believed that one of them could have been Massasoit. So a huge connection there of Massasoit, or just in general, the community in Swansea and that connection to Burrs Hill. You can imagine going back from Gardener's Neck to Burrs Hill, easy on a boat. I think it's an important, Burrs Hill's an important site. I personally am so interested in Gardener's Neck. I think it's a really important part of Swansea history for sure. So at this time too, we see these material changes. So like I was saying before, we had clay pottery, and we do see some woodworking tools and hoes for making our gardens. What we see with the exchange with Euro-Americans is we start seeing these brass kettles, teacups, buttons, smoking pots. Wampum is huge, even fur trade. We see all these new things being exchanged. Gun flints, not just used, and guns themselves are starting to be an important part. They're seeing the usefulness in trading, which Native people have always done with each other, so it makes sense to start seeing that across with Euro-American. And I really thought this was interesting, and I don't know if everyone actually knows. Kettle recycling was huge, so you get this huge kettle. You have an amazing example of one. And Native people often recycled them, so what's trash to one is someone's treasure. They started seeing, using the metal, they could use them for a lot of points were made from one kettle, if you could imagine. They're incredibly sharp and useful, and it became really a prized possession. So you start seeing more and more beads and personal adornment, chest plates out of these brass and copper kettles. So some of these are actually, I think, the bottom, the brass spoon is from Burrs Hill. So a lot of these implements are starting to be used and recycled from colonial things, but are very much a native item. So that's really interesting too. So after the passing of Massasoit, we start to see King Philip's War. Obviously, Swansea gets on the map. Not far from here. We start to see King Philip War. It's a little hard to see, but Swansea's on there in June 1675. So that conflict, obviously important to us, or what I've come across is in certain areas when I'm working or doing archaeological survey, I'm curious to see if I see a burn layer. Because I want to know, was there a house burned here from King Philip's War? So that's something that could actually still be in the archaeological record, which I think is really interesting. And most people wouldn't think, like, what do you care if there's like a little burn layer? But it's come up before where we actually wonder if we could still see the remnants of that war. Not only that, I know that University of Connecticut has been doing a lot of work in conflict in general, but Pequot War and King Philip's War, and actually looking for some of these battle areas. So you're actually able to see, and they're reflected in some of the notes taken by Euro-Americans and through discussions with tribal elders. So a lot of that is still actually you can find archaeologically, which is pretty amazing and not destroyed. And so I just want to, so as we, after the end of King Philip's War, we do start to see, this map on the upper right is all these different tribes and bands. And a lot of people are just like, who was here? A lot of native groups were here. I think a lot of people don't realize how many are still here, which is really important too. Oftentimes, like in this map, you can see the arrow kind of going off. So a lot of native people were sold into slavery in the Bahamas, and there's actually still a group of Wampanoag people in the Bahamas that have a powwow every 5 to 10 years, and they invite their cousins to come. A lot of people don't understand that that's still alive and well, and even followed them far, far away as they were being sold. But eventually we see native people being placed into these praying Indian towns. Natick, Massachusetts is a large one that most people have heard of. Using religion and trying to save native people became a popular popular aspect. Those towns or those areas are well recorded, and often Native people retained their identity or who they were, and a lot of people don't realize that either. So I just kind of wanted to bring that up. I thought the seal was really interesting because a lot of people, you know, they see this Native person. At the time, it was thought of biblically, like the Native people are here, they're waiting for us to save them. This was a depiction of people needing to be saved, but in reality, they did not want to be saved. So I actually had trouble finding a really early map of Swansea. So I unfortunately had to skip to 1831. But even this one I thought was really interesting because you start to see Luthor's Corner. We see, you know, essentially the Luthor Museum that we still go to. And there's also several other structures. There are little black dots, which is hard to see, but definitely in Swansea, the opening up of some major routes and crossings. The Cold River was a major point and was used by natives, and eventually too along the shores we have a large shipyard and some major historic sites. So by 1871, a lot of these roads you probably recognize, and some of them were native trails as well. Cummings Road, Hales Hill Road, a lot of those are known native paths that we still use in Swansea. And it's my expertise, so I apologize, I keep going back in time, but colonial, you know, revolution, Industrial Revolution, Swansea, we really start to see the effects from Fall River, and more people are moving in, more money's coming in, and how that affected the town. So I really wanted to talk about like what we have in Swansea archaeologically, because I think all of you are probably well versed in the actual I should say history, and like a lot of you are docents, you probably know more than me. I have to know about every town in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So I really wanted to focus on the archaeological record, which isn't showing up in the books necessarily. And overall, for pre-contact resources are Native American before contact with European. We have several articles by the Massachusetts Archaeological Society, which I mentioned. There's several burials that are talked about. And overall, 36 Native American sites are listed with the state. So the Massachusetts Historical Commission keeps a record of archaeological sites we find. They also are, they will review our information and make sure that it's, we are focusing, or archaeologists are focusing on important questions to tribal people, historical societies, interested parties. And what I found was that there was only 36 sites, and 3 of those were large villages. 2 of them focus on either side of the Coal River. I think there's many more. That doesn't even count what's potentially at Gardener's Neck and other sites. Some of that is also a reflection that there's only been 13 professional reports and surveys, and I've written 3 of them in the last 4 years. And I've actually found, I don't know, probably 10 of the sites, and it's been focused on utility right-of-ways. So sometimes where we see a focus or a lot of archaeological sites is only because it's like where we've actually been able to dig. I'm not going to go dig on anyone's private property. It doesn't work that way. But I thought that was really interesting. So given the opportunity in a very small linear channel, found a ton of sites. What does that say about the rest of Swansea? Ton of stuff. 12,000 years of stuff everywhere. And a lot of these reports too, I say professional reports or surveys, but some of those could be terrestrial. They were walking and saying like, there's really good evidence that there's something here. And those might also have not actually found anything either. So I say 13 professional reports and surveys, but they might not have been digging for those. They might have just been looking. Or assessing and saying like there might be sites there. So this is one of the sites I found. I thought it was really interesting that out of those 36 sites, there's 3 villages, and then there's several rock shelters. This was kind of an example of one of them. I know not totally sheltery, but the large rock in the distance, there was several projectile points or arrowheads found at the base of it, a small campfire. The majority of those sites were small campsites where native people were living. An example of the points we find are here. And these were actually closer to the Cummings Road site, which I also found, which was also considered, these are called small stem, the ones at the bottom. The one at the top, it's actually kind of rusty. The material is like an argillite, which is very soft actually, and it weathers, so it actually looks rusty, and that's more of a transitional archaic. So these could be about 4,000 to 3,000 or 2,000 years old, these point types. So in general, we're seeing around 4,000, 3,000 years ago in Swansea, people were using every part. It wasn't just along the rivers, it was all over the place, and they were actually looking at these large rocky areas, and they were probably great hunting grounds. So they were probably all over it. So I also wanted to bring in, so for my graduate work, Carl was nice enough to help me out, and I was able to look at the collections at the Luthor Museum. So several collectors over the years have been bringing in found objects, and a lot of them are arrowheads. So the Luthor Museum had over 300, and potentially there's more, to be honest, right? And we had a ton of other tools, which Carl brought an example of some of them. I found that there was a ton of net sinkers, so large stones that could be fashioned with rope and used for netting, for catching fish. But overall, almost 120 of these small stemmed type. So that type is typically like 3,000 to almost 1,000 years ago was used, and we see a ton of them. It was overwhelming in the collection. Also a lot of quartz and a lot of quartz triangle points as well. So that's, it seems like the preferred object, although this is always tricky. Like I said, I often care about exactly where in the ground it is. I want to know how deep, if it was in a pit with anything else. It would be really interesting if someone found them all together or cached, and I don't know that from this collection. So we had to use what we had to make some ideas. And overall, it seems that preference for quartz, they were probably just going to the beach and getting cobbles and using what they had. They were also probably utilizing the quartzite that was in the rock shelters that we just saw. So like in this back there, that's all kind of that conglomerate or pudding stone, I've called it, filled with quartzite cobbles. You literally hit that once, you can take out a big cobble and you can make several tools. So it's super easy to get at. Also makes amazing vantage points too. So you could go and crawl to the top of that, make a fire, and probably communicate very far from some of those vantage points in Swansea, which is really great and really interesting. Sorry, I don't know what time it is, hopefully. So historical resources. So I also wanted to focus on overall 20 post-contact or historical archaeological sites in Swansea. I think we all can imagine there's so many more. This is also the same thing with the Native American sites. It's a reflection of where people are actually testing, not on private property. Frankly, Swansea has a ton of still standing buildings. They had 256 above ground architectural features. So that's houses, cemeteries, monuments, all different types of things. Barns, churches. So I think it was really interesting. There's only 20, but when you think about that, 250 are still standing. That's pretty amazing. And I'm sure if I put a test pit next to any one of them, there'd be a lot of interesting information next to them. I also thought it was interesting to put in that 42 of those are cemeteries. I found that when I started looking at what my company has done in Swansea, we had actually 3 cemetery removals. So essentially someone was building a house and found a small family plot. So those historic sites or archaeological sites were actually cemeteries. So small family plots, a lot of people don't realize that just like everything else, there's trends. Cemeteries, and especially too, I put the Friends Meeting House. Friends Meeting House, they often did not use stone markers. They did not have stone walls, probably before the 1850s. So you didn't have a nice stone wall around your family to know where their stones were. And also, interesting, the Friends, they also would only use a sheet and bury only a couple of feet deep. So you wouldn't necessarily find a coffin, and it could easily be disturbed by shallow digging. So it can be problematic for cemeteries like that. I also thought it was interesting, so early Puritans, for trends on cemeteries, they didn't want to put walls and make them pretty because it was meant to scare you. Like, you took kids there to be like, this is where you end up. And a lot of times people don't look at a cemetery and they're like, oh, well, if that was a cemetery, I'd know it. Not necessarily, because it was meant to be derelict. It was meant to be scary up until like the mid-1800s. And then that kind of Victorian belief, or that just in general protecting and putting walls, putting different stones, having different motifs, all of that started to change. And that's 1850s, that's way late. I mean, if you think you have a couple of hundred years before that where you were interring people and have decent sized communities, it's a lot of people unaccounted for, or at least from my archaeological brain, that's what I think of. And then in general too, I thought it was great that there's 9 historic areas. I think for Swansea, a smaller town, that's a lot of area that's considered important, that town people value. They're like, hey, these areas are important. How they look, the feel, what they bring to our community is important to us. And 5 of those are actually on the National Register. National Register is a federal list that means that those things are protected to a point. It means that if something's going to happen in that area, there has to be a discussion. It doesn't mean things don't change. It just means that people value them, and there has to be talked about how we deal with them. So Luthor Museum is one of them. There's several districts themselves. Gardener's Neck is not one, which I thought was really interesting. So I also wanted to bring up what we find. So this is a project that PAL actually did several years ago, in 2004. And in general, even though, so we find a series of stone walls. It looks like a bunch of stones. But to us, we start to see a house, we see a barn, we see pens, we see concrete platforms, we see a well, and even potential slate gravestones are marked. So this was a rendering after we found it. It's very overgrown. And the project wasn't going to disturb it, so we didn't test the house. But once we start looking back, we look into historic maps, we look at deed research to get a better picture, and we have questions. How did these people live? And this one was accounted as a slave farmstead. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, it wasn't disturbed. It's actually still there. It's in the woods, getting grown up. It wasn't being disturbed, so we didn't test any further, but we didn't find many artifacts. But we were able to get an understanding that obviously, even though this shows up on the 1870 map, what do we know about these people and how they lived? Was it very different than how people lived in Fall River? What kind of, did they mostly have local redware, milk plates, or did they have nice pearl wares that they were bringing in? So some of the artifacts that we see at the Luthor Museum, that's all connected to how the local people were living in that narrative. And sometimes we just ask simple questions of like, what were in those pens. How were they living? How did they pay their bills? How did they connect to their community and their church? So we use data like these old maps along with our actual artifacts, which tell us a story. I wish I had more, but like I said, there hasn't been too many excavations in Swansea for me to go further than this. And even this one was right on the line with Somerset. In the picture, you kind of get an idea. I'm sorry, it's black and white. At the time, we were using black and white still for some of our reports. It was what the state was requiring too for National Register items. But you can see the stone wall in the back, and the stone up front, we actually weren't sure if that was a gravestone, a family member that was there. So it's still in place. We're unsure because it's been undisturbed how that's connected to the rest of the site area. But what was interesting by looking at the overall site in the pens, as people, if you've been to a farm and how things interact over time, it can make a difference. How close is your well to your house? And how close is your potential gravestone to that well? Because the people prior to 1850s probably did not think twice about water contamination and putting grandpa by the well. It wasn't a thing. The science wasn't there. So simple things like this, for us, unmarked stone, it's a possibility that this was just a really early internment of a family member. And at the time of that internment, it didn't matter that it was close to the well. And at the time, they wanted it to be close to the house, maybe to visit them. Something as simple as that. And also just in general, the outbuildings and stone walls tell us how they use the landscape and can be really great for the narrative overall. So in general, I just wanted to, what did we learn from the archaeological record? I think that there's a ton of resources in Swansea, an unbelievable amount of resources archaeologically, and a lot of stories to tell. I think it's important, especially for historical societies, like what's important to all of you? And like what do you want to share and preserve over time with the communities? What areas might be important that you think that, we need to keep this on the map. We need the town planners to think about. These are all important questions, and on a town level, it's groups like this that keep that history alive. And I think that sometimes school programs and having those discussions are just really, really important. Another place that I loved as a kid, Abrams Rock. I thought that story was amazing. I know it's still on the website, the folklore of it. A contact period Abram who wanted to go back with his people and jump from the rock 3 times. These are amazing stories that are part of the narrative of Swansea and are really important. Thank you. I hopefully didn't blow my time or was too all over the place. But thanks everybody. I appreciate you guys being here. I figured we could also, I'm sure there was things that I missed in my going through, but I figured we could have some questions and discussion. Yes?
Do you ever use ground penetrating radar or lidar for graves?
Absolutely. I didn't want to get too into, when people talk about archaeology, there's so many different aspects. The lidar has been incredibly useful, especially for like the historic foundation. So this would show up on lidar. So from a plane, a picture's taken. Despite the density of the woods, we're able to get an understanding of what's there. You can actually see stone walls once you can read lidar. So it's an incredible resource. We luckily have a GIS, a geospatial person who can actually create these maps. So if I'm going out to a property, and right now it's really popular, solar farms are really popular. It might be acres and acres of just woods. And I'm like, whoa, what am I looking at? Like, what? There's so much area for me to walk over, to physically look for maybe a little unmarked grave. It's incredibly overwhelming. the lidar produces an amazing picture. Ground penetrating radar, we usually, for some areas it's come up that there's been, maybe there's actually a cemetery and they want to make sure there's nothing outside. So like I said, it was a trend to put up a stone wall. It was also a trend that if you were a slave owner or had a native indentured servant, they might go right outside the wall. They weren't in the wall. So there's an issue in New England or across the US or just in general that how do we protect those unmarked graves? How do we look for them without too much work or a price tag, unfortunately, is on these things. And the idea of using that ground penetrating radar and expanding our look without actually putting a shovel in the ground or using a backhoe to scrape that ground to look for grave shafts is like an incredible thing. I have a good friend who does amazing work with GSSI. He was one of the archaeologists that went down to Jamestown, and he was able to, the work he did, from what I understand, he was able to use ground penetrating radar to not just know that there was a grave shaft. So for some of you, the radar goes into the ground, it looks like crazy squigglies. I can't read it, it's terrible. But someone who's trained can look at those squigglies and say like, oh, there's someone excavated a grave there. He's actually making it so precise that he could say the feet are here and the head is here. And then they dug it up and he knew exactly where it was. So it's almost like X-ray vision, which archaeologists have been talking about for years.
I know in Puritan, they use it in a lot of, some of the cemeteries.
Yep, yeah, for sure. Unfortunately, it's still newer work, and we don't have anyone at our lab that does it. We often will hire out and have someone do it specific for the project. It has come up too. There are, unfortunately, shady construction circles. It has come up, not in Swansea, Westport, that a contractor pulled all the headstones, and a local historical society came in and said, I know there's a cemetery there. You gotta go find it. And luckily, you know, we were able to go in and find it. But unfortunately, those people still exist. But in general, I think that most people value graves and see the importance of protecting them. Not that they're not moved. Our company has moved several large cemeteries, one in Boston that was 1,100 people. It was a huge undertaking. How the city of Boston dealt with graves, they closed them and just paved them. That was a practice because your relative was up in heaven, so the body didn't matter. And in the 1920s, you didn't have money to dig them up, so it just seemed like a better solution to cover them and pave it and take their stone and put it somewhere else. But yeah, the ground penetrating, it's amazing what the technology, what's coming. And for someone who works with dirt, or who my area of interest is soil, and now they're saying that you can do protein analysis on a bag of dirt, and it can tell you if there was animal blood there. I've sent groundstone tools, so like a tool that's been made by pitting and smoothing. I've sent those out and have gotten protein and platelet samples, and I know that they use that kind of metate or for grinding grass, because they found it pitted in the stone from thousands of years ago. It's amazing. And we don't even know what's coming. So as an archaeologist, sometimes I look at projects and a lot of native people in particular too, they don't want us to disturb it, because we don't know what's coming, like what the science is coming that we could learn from. So it's tricky when we do take samples, how we're preserving them or how we're digging, so that way some of it's maybe still preserved. Those things are important too.
Yeah, how do you choose the areas that you're going to look for something?
Well, we're specifically by contract, And those contracts are based on disturbance. So, I should say, for example, if you are using federal funds and you're putting in a new building, you would need us to come in and look at an area, and we might focus specifically where you're going to dig that foundation. And anything outside, if you're not going to touch it, we won't either. But often in construction projects, as you can imagine, they don't know. They might need to put in a water filtration system off to the side. So sometimes the projects, we do test the entire area and make sure there's nothing there. But it can be very, very specific. Like, I'm putting something right here, I only dig right there. So I would say, like, prior to the 1980s, a lot of the large-scale surveys, they might have come and knocked on a door and said, I'm with the university, I'm with Smithsonian, I'm really curious what's there, so I want to dig there. It's very rare that that happens now, although some universities do put together those contracts or those kind of projects. But mine is, we do for larger scale projects, we have sampling strategies, statistical analysis of areas. So we say 500 feet from water, not disturbed, sandy soils. I'm going to put most of my testing there. So there are projects that you're sampling, especially with the smaller holes. We're not digging up a whole site area. So in that respect, we do use statistical analysis to pick spots of low sensitivity, moderate, or high, and test according to that. Does that make sense?
Well, so most of your work is contractual work with developers who are putting buildings in.
Buildings, large-scale utilities are a huge part of our projects right now. Because of that federal permitting, so it's Section 106 from National, I should say, it's a federal permitting process. We do go under state permits too, but a lot of our work it's just like wetlands or endangered species are protected, so are archaeological sites to an extent. Yes?
My family, well, my grandfather used to own from the borderline from Sunset and Swansea all over to Stevens Road.
Oh, man.
And it was said, like I think I spoke to Mr. Becker about, that there's an ancient road that goes from here all the way to the meeting house in Somerset.
Oh.
And it goes right by, and that's where like Montauk, and I don't know who else is in there digging up stuff. But it was like, I was told that there was a Hessian soldier that was killed on that road.
Oh, wow.
But, I mean, you know, nothing was ever found. But there's a lot of areas that there's like, they have found old coins
Yeah.
and different things it's right on the borderline between the Somerset and Swansea.
Line.
Line.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised. I wondered if we actually talked about that, Carl. Did you tell me about that maybe a while ago?
We believe we know about a Revolutionary War veteran
Oh.
who's buried up in that side of Swansea. But I've also heard the stories about the Hessian soldier.
Yeah.
And I
It
don't
was
have
my
a real,
grandfather that
I don't have a good location for it.
Yeah.
you know, but I mean, I'm just saying, there's a lot of spots in Swansea that people don't even know
Right.
of the historic value, and it's a shame, like, if a company like that goes in and digs it all up,
Right.
or another company, and nobody knows about it.
Right. I do think the historical societies, it's a way to gather that information. Carl is like a keeper of all the things.
Corner of Shopside Road and Marble Street, there was told, like by Mrs. the Isherwood used to live there, that there was in the back of the yard of the families, there was an American Revolutionary soldier that was buried there.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be
That's,
surprised.
that's the one we'd like to do something about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We actually, I think, talked about the ground penetrating radar or something like that. And like I said, it's tricky. the
It's private
equipment.
property, you know?
And private property, some people too get nervous. I don't want you to find anything. You know, as far as lease agreements and stuff go for like electrical right-of-ways. Because they think they're gonna be restricted, but I always like to tell people, I find things, it doesn't stop construction. It might slow it a little bit, but in general, there's always a way to solve or figure out a way to make it work for everyone. I think sometimes it's blown out of proportion, like how much time and what a waste it is, when there's a lot of important resources and a narrative, an important story that could be told. I do recommend that, we've done it before, where we do town-wide surveys, and you actually have public nights where you can invite people in, and we draw a circle on a map, and it's put into a report. And like your town planning board, if you don't have a planning board, your board of selectmen can use those maps when they're looking at stuff and say, oh, I don't know, someone told me that there's stuff going on. It can be a very useful report for construction and for projects. I mean, not to toot our own horn, there's other companies that do it, but it just seems to be a useful thing, and it's a way to collect information from the entire town. I know that I've done them where we just come in, people can bring in items, we look at them, you can tell people like, oh, yep, it sounds, you know, they can put a dot on the map, and I can say like, yeah, you collected that from there, that's useful information for me. So it's a helpful item, and it's a way to collect that and have like a record, a physical record, which can be helpful, or even having a map at the museum and just putting the notes on it. Dots of people's memories, it's important.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The lane across from Home Depot on Route 6 there, that used to be a farm years ago. Was that land of any interest for archaeology?
I'm sure it would be. I mean, I
Well,
just.
it's all dug up now. I don't think we're getting on it.
Yeah, unfortunately,
The soil is piled up.
Home Depots and parking lots, and even newer, that when I first started this 18 years ago, when a housing development would go in, they would really only disturb usually the house lots. Now they look like a moonscape. They blow it up.
I'm talking
So-
about the land across from Home Depot.
Yeah, so like the Home
Yeah.
Depot
Hotel.
probably did,
Well, they sold, that was, believe it or not, that was conservation property that the selectmen in Somerset decided to overrule, and they sold it for the development of a hotel.
Yes.
And they went in,
We hate it.
so,
All right, so if there was anything archaeology, there it's gone already.
most
It's been
likely.
destroyed.
Unfortunately,
Whether it be an
so,
old family,
so part of my
cemetery.
job would also, is looking at places like that, and
Yeah.
they probably sold the topsoil.
Yeah.
They probably had to blow out rock, and unfortunately, a lot of that would be gone. Sometimes those sections are preserved, but in general, for newer development, it, even under the pavement is, they grade and put soils down. But I like to bring up older construction techniques, a little different. So like we've had huge projects in Warwick, Rhode Island, huge sewer projects where there's actually whole villages under 2 inches of pavement, and it's all still there. So depending on the part of town and how it was constructed, you can have these really amazing archaeological sites still under there, which some people can't imagine. Unfortunately, I think the Home Depot is too new, and I do think that construction techniques, they tend to be pretty violent, I'll say. Pretty extreme. Drainage and stuff has changed, all the laws have changed, so it's not necessarily just to make a mess or destroy an archaeological site. It's like literally restrictions within town say, gonna make sure that it drains properly. It means you have to put so much fill so nothing sinks and nothing cracks. All of it's connected, and understanding that.
I have a question for Carl. When were the Heshrams in Swansea?
that's just it. As far as I know, they were not.
Yeah, that's like,
So.
Some in Rhode Island, though.
They're in
It may-
Newport.
it
I was
may
gonna
have-
say Rhode
They were
Island.
private.
Rhode Island, Warren, Bristol, but it may have been deserted. But I've got no documentation or anything else to go by, and unless somebody tells me, I think it was here, and great-grandmother used to visit it, I've got nothing to go by, so it becomes a myth. And at that point.
Tricky.
because the Battle of Fall River was on the Taunton River, and Fall River, the north end.
Yes.
Yeah, I never heard about anything in Swansea except slave getting picked up in the river by the British.
And I think Fall River was attacked by British troops.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what, yeah.
I've only ever heard Rhode Island, like parts of Rhode Island
Yeah.
personally.
What do you know about the old slave house in Somerset? That was taken down,
Not very much.
not very much.
Myself,
Well,
no.
as a child, I lived near there and I was fascinated. And I thought, I was told that there's a tunnel that went down to the Taunton River because they were freeing slaves.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Swansea was a really early place that took in
And
people.
particularly Somerset, because
Yeah.
Somerset was involved in abolition
Yeah.
very early
Yeah.
on.
My house has a slave cell. That's on Valhorn Line Corner.
Do you mean the old slave farm? The old slave farm that's like a farm
Yeah,
now?
yeah, they had an old ferry that crossed the river.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a beautiful house, and I think they moved it to the other side of Route 6, but I'm not sure. But it was devastating because it was a piece of history, you know?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Erin.
Thank